Welcome back. This is Special Session. I'm your host, Brian Schott. Well, it's over. It's done. By the time you listen to this show, the 2025 legislature will have wrapped up its work for the year. That means a bunch of villages are about to get their idiots back. At least they'll be where they can't do any more damage. Why can't I shake this sneaky suspicion that we'll be back for a few special sessions over the coming months? Coming up a little bit later on today's show, I'll be joined by Senator Daniel Thatcher. He announced on Friday afternoon that he was leaving the Utah Republican Party to join the Utah Forward Party. Thatcher told me that his former GOP colleagues were becoming increasingly disconnected from the public. We'll talk about his decision and how he plans to approach his job as a caucus of one. He's still in office through 2026. We'll have that conversation coming up for you in a little bit, but first, let's get into the news from the past week. One of the big issues coming into this session was a controversy over vote by mail, election integrity. A lot of this is stemming from Donald Trump's false claims as falsehoods about a stolen election in 2020. Those have never gone away, and more Republicans have gotten on board with those conspiracy theories or believing that things need to be done to secure the integrity of elections. And Utah's no different. There was an audit last year that I've told you about before in this podcast where they looked at election procedures in the state, and they found that possibly 2 deceased voters may have cast ballots, probably a family member who cast those ballots for them. That's being looked into. Because of that, top Republicans in the legislature, led by House Speaker Mike Schultz, decided that they needed to do something about it. So their big election bill, HB 300 that came out this year, initially it was going to do away with vote by mail. You still could get a ballot in the mail, but you would have to return it at a drop box and show ID. That's how they would stop people who are not citizens or illegal immigrants or dead people from voting. This bill changed a number of times throughout the process, and the final version, they finally pushed over the finish line the day before the legislature ended. What it does is it still allows for vote by mail, but by 2029, you're going to have to opt into getting your ballot in the mail. So you have to register and say, yes, I want to get a ballot in the mail. And you'll have to re-register every 8 years. And if you miss 2 elections in a row, then you're going to have to re-register. And in order to make sure you are who you say you are, you're going to have to include the last 4 digits of your ID or your state ID card or some identification in the last 4 digits of that on the ballots. That is the version of the bill that passed to secure the integrity of elections. I think it ended up in a much better place than it started, because getting rid of vote by mail would have been a huge mistake. It's very popular here. One bill that surprised me that was killed was from House Majority Whip Carrie Ann Lisenby. And that was one that I told you about, where she was trying to get the state to pull out of ERIC, which is that multi-state voter database, the clearinghouse where they share voter registration information to crack down on voter fraud. But Republicans really turned against ERIC because, again, conspiracy theories about elections. And that bill was moving forward, but then it got killed in a Senate committee. It surprised me because they had a good debate about it. I thought it was going to move forward. I thought it was going to pass. And then all of a sudden, boom, it's dead. And backers were really shocked because they were so confident that it was going to move on to the Senate floor that a lot of them were in another committee hearing. The people who wanted to see this were in another committee hearing that same day because they figured that this one is safe, but it got killed. And so that one's off the table. But the big election change, vote by mail is here to stay. That's a good thing. They're making you prove who you are with the last 4 digits of an ID. That's also a good thing. Getting rid of vote by mail would have been a big mistake, especially in the rural parts of the state, because it's really, really hard to get to a ballot box, especially when the closest one could be dozens and dozens of miles away. So the bill ended up in a pretty good place considering where it started, because to get rid of vote by mail would have been a bad thing for a lot of people here in the state. That's the big election bill that passed. It's now on Governor Cox's desk waiting for his signature. So last week I told you about the really scary plan by lawmakers to take over pre-election debates in the state. It was HB 557 from Representative Nelson Abbott, and this bill would have created an 11-person committee at Utah Valley University that would be stacked with political appointees. Those 11 people, 7 of them would be appointed by Republicans, 4 of them by Democrats. And this committee would have power over these debates, scheduling them, who got to participate, who the moderator was, and even what topics would be discussed. Well, surprisingly, that bill was held in a House committee late on Friday of last week. That was probably shocking news to legislative leaders because they had funded this bill in the budget recommendations that came out after that committee hearing was over with. So they were expecting it to move forward. They had funded this bill to create the Utah Debate Committee, but right before they released these budget recommendations, the bill was held in the committee. Usually that's the end of it, right? Usually when a bill gets held or defeated on Capitol Hill, that's the end of it. But legislative leaders were so hell-bent to get this done. This is something they wanted to do, that they went ahead and they're creating this Utah Debate Committee anyway, even though there's no legislation authorizing that. What did they do? They just stuck that money in the budget anyway, and they're using intent language to create this committee. Instead of $600,000 to the Herbert Institute at Utah Valley University, they are now going to split that between the Hinckley Institute at the University of Utah and the Herbert Institute at UVU. The debate committee will be housed at the Hinckley Institute, and the intent language says that those two organizations will have to come up with a plan for creating this debate committee and how it operates. This intent language in the budget goes to great pains to say, hey, this is all nonpartisan. It's a nonpartisan nature. They really want you to know that it's nonpartisan. And that's fascinating because the Republicans on the Executive Appropriations Committee, Republican leadership, they wanted this to happen so badly that they went around the normal legislative process and just stuck this in the budget anyway. Why? Because they could. Because they want control over political debates in the state. And I've told you before, I think this is alarming. I don't think the government should be involved in this at all. And if our media here in the state had any guts whatsoever, they would refuse to work with this organization. You hear conservatives talk about all the time about the proper role of government. What is the proper role of government? They drag that out at the caucuses when they're trying to vet candidates. What is the proper role of government? Not this. Not this at all. It is not the proper role of government to be making decisions about frickin' political debates. This is outrageous. You should be outraged. As I said it before, if the media here in Utah had any guts, they would refuse to work with this organization. But I really don't have any hope that that's going to happen. Government-funded and controlled political debates. To quote George Orwell, I warned you. I warned you. The unions are going to try to overturn the union-busting bill, HB 267, at the ballot box through a referendum. You'll remember HB 267, that's the bill from Representative Jordan Tusher that takes away the collective bargaining rights for public employees, teachers, firefighters, police officers. They no longer can collectively bargain for wages and benefits. The unions were hoping that Governor Spencer Cox would veto the bill. That didn't happen. I would have been shocked if it did, but he did not veto the bill. So now they're going to try to overturn it at the ballot box with a referendum. Earlier this week, they tried to file for the referendum at the Lieutenant Governor's office, and they were a little bit premature because the Lieutenant Governor's office says that you have to wait for the legislature to be over with before you file the referendum. So they're going to file this on Saturday, and it's going to be a really heavy lift if they're going to get there. To put the issue on the ballot, they need to collect more than 140,000 signatures from registered voters in the state. That's about 8% of all of the active voters in Utah as of January 1st of this year. They have to get over 140,000 signatures at a minimum, and they also have to collect a certain number of signatures from voters in 15 of the state's 29 Senate districts. So it's at 8% of active voters in 15 of the 29 Senate districts, so just over half. And they've only got 40 days to do it. Law governing referendums say they have to collect these signatures either 40 calendar days from the conclusion of the legislative session, which that clock would start ticking on Saturday, or 30 days from the date that the first person signs a petition, whichever one comes first. So essentially, they'll have 40 days from the end of the legislative session, it's mid-April, to go out and collect all of these signatures. Now, that's a time-consuming process because lawmakers made a bunch of changes to the a referendum process. So when you sign a petition, you have to attest that you read the law and you understand what it does, the law you're trying to overturn, and then you have to sign your name. So they collect all these signatures, they get verified, but that's not the end of the process, because then there is a period of time where people who sign the referendum petition can get their name taken off of that petition. And all of the names of everybody who signed it are going to be posted online for everyone to see. So if you sign this petition, your name's going to show up online along with your voter ID number. That's the only information that's going to show up, but your name will show up. If you remember back in 2018, there were 4 attempted citizen initiatives, not a referendum. This is to overturn a law by the legislature, but a citizen initiative. 3 of them made the ballot. That was the independent redistricting, the medical cannabis, and the Medicaid expansion, but 1 didn't. And that was the Count My Vote, which would have gotten rid of the caucus and convention system for nominating candidates, and Utah would have gone to a direct primary. They got enough signatures initially to put that on the ballot, but another group led by hardcore Republicans calling themselves Keep My Vote, so it was Count My Vote and Keep My Vote, intentionally confusing. Keep My Vote went out and started contacting people who had already signed the petition, trying to convince them to take their name off. And they got enough people to take their name off of the petition to take it off the ballot. So I don't know if there's going to be an organized effort to try to get people to take their name off the petition, but there's a really, really high bar that the unions are going to have to meet if they want to put this on the ballot, and that clock starts ticking on Saturday. There was a last-minute dust-up between the Utah Legislature and the state auditor. Tina Cannon was elected to replace John Dougal, who decided to try to run for Congress. She is the first Republican woman elected to a statewide office on her own. Now, I know that we had Olene Walker and Deidre Henderson as lieutenant governors, but they were part of a ticket. Tina Cannon is the first Republican woman to be elected to a statewide office. The first woman elected to a statewide office in Utah was Democratic Attorney General Jan Graham. Tina Cannon just took office back in January, and in a last-minute change, late on Thursday night, the Republicans in the legislature substituted a bill that concerned office space at the Capitol, and they basically made a power play trying to kick her out of her office suite on the second floor of the Capitol because they were going to use that space for offices for Republican senators. They dropped this thing in at the last second. It kicked her out of that space, and it also kicked the lieutenant governor's staff out of some space that is currently occupied by the Utah Elections Office. And what they were going to do is they were going to send the auditor and the elections office over to the Senate building, which is on the east side of the Capitol complex right now. And that's really not a good look, because what they're doing is it really looked like the Republicans in the Senate were picking on the two women, Deidre Henderson, Tina Cannon, kicking them out of the Capitol. This whole thing started last year. There was a bill in 2024 that lawmakers pushed through that was going to move Cannon out of her office in the Capitol. But that legislation required that she be given substantially similar space in the main Capitol building. So they were going to move her out and put her somewhere else. There was talk that they were going to put her in the basement. But anyway, what happened was at the last second, like late on Thursday, they substituted this bill. And in the bill were the additions moving her completely out of the Capitol and moving the elections office completely out of the Capitol, where the elections office was. That was space that was going to be taken over by House Republicans. And Cannon accused Senate President Stuart Adams of bullying her. She said that she only learned that they were going to throw her out of her office on Tuesday of this week. She'd been asking for a boost to her staff budget. She didn't get it when they approved budgets, the first part of the budget process, midway through the session. And so when she was going to Adams' office on Tuesday of this week, she thought she was going to be talking about her budget, and they were going to do something in the supplemental appropriations. Instead, that's when she found out she was being thrown out of her office in the Capitol building. Cannon objected to that because in this original legislation that was passed last year, it created a process, a collaborative process, where you would have the governor, the lieutenant governor, the auditor, attorney general, the treasurer, and the Senate president and speaker of the House. They would all come together and discuss the space in the Capitol. There's not a lot of space to expand, and so they were going to work on a collaborative process to decide how to divvy up the space. And that process was not followed because this was a straight-up power grab attempt by the legislature. They dropped this language into the bill at the last second, and they were just going to power it through on the last day. Well, Cannon started fighting back. She went to the media, and the pressure from the media caused the legislature to back off. Late on Friday evening, the bill that needed one more vote in the Senate to push it through and send it to the governor that would boot Cannon out of her office, they abandoned it. They sent it back to rules. So they killed it because they knew that it was not a good look for them to not only be picking on the two female lawmakers in their party. They didn't do this to Attorney General Derek Brown. They didn't touch his office space, but they were going to kick the female auditor and the staff of the female lieutenant governor out of the Capitol building and move them elsewhere on the Capitol ground. So that wasn't a good look. And also you got to think about the optics of this. They were going to boot a full-time constitutional officer. Cannon's part of the executive branch. She was elected to that position. She's there full-time. This is a full-time position. And they were going to replace her with space for part-time lawmakers who apparently didn't want to be walking over from the Senate building. They couldn't be bothered to walk the few hundred feet from the Senate building into the main Capitol. Do their feetsies hurt? Were their widow wigs getting tired? That's really not a good look. This was a straight up power grab by the Republicans in the legislature. And I have said this before. This legislature is becoming increasingly imperial. And what I mean by that is they are accumulating more and more power. Maybe they thought there wasn't going to be much of the pushback, but it's telling that they did this on the second to last day of the legislature, that they dropped in this major change at the end of the day on Thursday, and then they were planning on ramming it through on Friday. But Cannon fought back, and she won. It's not often that Stuart Adams takes an L, but he took the L on this one. They wanted to expand in that space and give more office space to the Republican caucus. But it looks like the ones who are over in the Senate building are going to have to continue to get their steps in to get over to the Capitol when they're up there a couple of times a month rather than full time like Tina Cannon is. Adams will never admit defeat, but this was a really, really, really bad look. Every year, the big fundraising event for county Republican parties is something known as the Lincoln Day dinner or the Lincoln Day lunch or breakfast, something that honors former President Abraham Lincoln. Well, this year, the Davis County Republicans have an interesting keynote speaker for their event, which is happening next week. Headlining their dinner is a man named Trennis Evans, who was part of the attempted insurrection at the U.S. Capitol on January 6th. He's the man you saw outside in some of the videos wearing a yellow beanie with a blue bullhorn. Outside of the Capitol, he was urging people to remain peaceful, but once he got inside, he urged the mob to continue entering the building. He allegedly did shots of Fireball whiskey while sitting in Nancy Pelosi's office during the attack. He was charged with a felony, later pled guilty to a misdemeanor charge, and he was pardoned by Donald Trump. That's who's going to be headlining the Lincoln Day dinner for the Davis County Republican Party next week. The Davis County Republican Party is one of the more, I want to say conservative, but I'm thinking fringier Republican parties in the state. That's where a lot of the right-wing activists in the party right now are coming from. It was at the Davis County Republican Convention where Trevor Lee knocked former Representative Steve Handy out of the race by getting just a handful of votes from delegates. They are far more to the right politically than mainstream Republicans in the state, is what I'm trying to say. So inviting Trennis Evans, a January 6th rioter, to speak at their event makes a lot of sense when you consider who makes up the base of the Davis County Republican Party. And they've really shifted right over the past few years. Their former chair, Daniela Harding, was a fairly moderate Republican. She was still very conservative, but a moderate Republican considering, where the party is right now. She was replaced by Yemi Arunsi, who won the race to become the party chair over Trevor Lee's mom the last time around. But Yemi Arunsi, great story. If you ever get a chance to talk to him, he's got a really great story. His family was rescued by American military when they were refugees. He came over to America, has become a very successful businessman. He was elected 2 years ago as the chairman of the party over Trevor Lee's mom. He's decided he's not going to run again. When I asked him why, he only said, "I'm out," but given with what he has to deal with and who he has to deal with as part of the committee that makes up the leadership of the Davis County Republican Party, it makes a lot of sense that he would be pulling the ripcord. Speaking of chairmanship races, he will not go away. Former Representative Phil Lyman, who unsuccessfully ran for governor last year, lost to Spencer Cox in the Republican primary, mounted a write-in campaign that was also unsuccessful, got about 13% of the vote, but he still finished third in the race. Well, he's decided he's going to run for the chairman of the entire state Republican Party. He made this announcement to, ironically, Davis County Republicans, a group of very right-wing Davis County Republicans this week, telling them that he was planning on running for party chair. The current party chair, Rob Axon, he had told me that he has not decided yet whether he's going to run for another term or not when the party meets for its convention in May. He'll make that decision in the next couple of weeks, but I have a feeling he'll probably try to run for another term. Lyman running for party chair does not seem as far-fetched as you might think. Republican delegates love him. Remember, he beat Spencer Cox at last year's Republican convention among the delegate vote almost 2-1. He is beloved by a large swath of Republican delegates. So it is not inconceivable that he could win that chairmanship race. And let's think a little bit about what it would mean for delegates to hand the keys to the Republican Party to Phil Lyman, who has said he's already running for governor again in 2028. He says he's running because he wants to root out an entrenched establishment group of Republicans who favor mainstream candidates and make it harder for insurgent candidates like himself to win races. So if he wins, you can expect over the next 2 years he will be breaking down what he sees as an entrenched establishment in the Republican Party. How that goes will be interesting because they are finally back on a good financial footing after digging out of the gigantic hole that former chair James Evans left for them. The party was in so much debt because Evans essentially let the far-right group of the party do what they wanted. They ran the show. Bills were unpaid for years. There were thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars of outstanding debts, and the people who had the money stopped donating to the party. So they finally got on the right footing after James Evans, and now they might hand the keys to Phil Lyman. Now, I'm not saying that Phil Lyman is James Evans, but Phil Lyman is a bomb thrower. He said that his stated goal is to break down the entrenched establishment. Does that mean that donors will stop giving money to the party? Will he alienate their donor base? Because that was a big point of contention for those big donors. They did not like that the party kept fighting the battle over SB 54, the signature path to the ballot, for years and years and years, and they just decided to stop giving, which contributed to the debt problems. Phil Lyman hates SB 54. He wants to get rid of the signature path. He says that's the reason why he's not governor now, and he's got a point. If the signature path did not exist, he would have defeated Spencer Cox at convention and won the Republican nomination and likely would be the governor right now. That should give Republicans pause, but I don't know if it will, putting Phil Lyman as the party chair. The other thing to think about is if Phil Lyman is elected chair, he will be the head of the Republican Party in the state, and the Republican governor is a man that Phil Lyman is convinced cheated to beat him for the Republican nomination last year. So you put Phil Lyman in charge of the Republican Party and all of the resources at his disposal for the party, he could make life hell for Spencer Cox for the next 2 years. I doubt he would run for a second term as chair because he's ramping up to run for governor. But can you imagine just the frustration that would cause Spencer Cox as the governor of Utah to have the chairman of your party in your state as a hostile entity? Because, again, Phil Lyman believes that Spencer Cox cheated to get on the ballot. He believes that he's been pushing the false claim that Cox didn't get enough signatures to qualify for the ballot. He's gone to court several times, all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, trying to kick Cox out of office. Can you imagine if he was in charge of the Republican Party and Cox, as the Republican governor of the state, might have to just grit his teeth and deal with a man who believes in his heart that he cheated? That would be a wild situation to live through for the next 2 years. But don't count it out because, as I said, Phil Lyman is beloved by Republican delegates, and they easily could make him the next chair of the Republican Party. Joining me now on the show is Senator Daniel Thatcher, formerly a Republican representing West Valley City. Senator Thatcher, it's nice to have you join me today. Let's talk about your big announcement you made on Friday morning. Tell us about it and what led to it.
Do you know, it's funny, people keep asking what was the last straw, and the reality is there wasn't a last straw. I feel like it's been just bales of hay after bales of hay. And really, I could go through and talk about, the labor bill or Amendment D, or I mean, even the petty stuff like poor people can't have soda. But at the end of the day, it all comes back to one root cause, and that is my feeling that the public is being ignored, that the public is being treated with what else do you call it but contempt. I can't be a part of that anymore. I think we've reached a point where my silence becomes louder than anything I could possibly say.
So this decision to leave the Republican Party, join the Utah Forward Party, has been a long time coming. You would be, at least in the time that I can remember, you will now be the first person representing or a member of a third party to hold an elected seat up on Utah's Capitol Hill. That's a significant decision that you made, because you're no longer part of the Republican caucus, which is the majority up there.
Well, actually, Mark Madsen, if you remember, did this about 10 years ago.
He went libertarian.
He joined the Libertarian Party, and I got to say, if I knew how to connect with Mark Madsen right now, the first thing I would say to him is, I really am sorry that it took me so long to come around. He was right all along.
And he left because there was some controversy over the marijuana legislation. That was the last straw for him, as far as I remember.
I don't want to speak for him, but I will say that he and I had several conversations on many occasions where he complained, that we're the party of liberty as long as you liberty exactly how I tell you to. And he was right, and I was slow realizing that Mark Madsen was right all along.
Yeah, the reason I didn't remember him is because in my head I keep thinking he went independent rather than as a libertarian.
Right. But let's actually end this on a positive note, because the reality is this: we don't have to give up. We don't have to accept things that we disagree with. Yes, we're going to need some major reform in the state of Utah. I believe that the core of the disconnect between the elected officials and the people of Utah is that the people of Utah don't elect us. We are elected through a closed, increasingly closed process where very, very few people are involved. I was elected by less than 70 people. We have legislators that served off 22 votes and a coin flip in a side room. We have legislators who are serving because they talked an existing legislator into clearing the deck and then registering to file to run against them with 5 minutes to go before closing, and then the incumbent dropping out, thereby handing a seat to a friend without a single vote being cast. These are things that disconnect the legislature from the public, that make us not representative. You can speak all day long about how important a republic is, but a republic is contingent on democratically electing their representatives. So at the end of the day, I found a way forward. You look at what the Forward Party stands for. They stand for natural rights, life, liberty, property, and the inherent right to dignity for all human beings. That is something that I don't care if you're a Republican, a Democrat, a Libertarian, we should all be able to coalesce around the idea that people deserve their constitutional right to representation, that we should listen to them. Now, I don't believe that I owe them my obedience, but I do owe them an accounting, and I feel that accounting is sorely lacking in our current setup. So I think this is the way forward.
I know you're pressed for time. Last thing I'd like to ask you is, what do you think that you can accomplish in the next year up on the Hill as a member of the Utah Forward Party? You're obviously not going to be caucusing with the Republicans. I don't expect you to caucus with the Democrats. What can you do as a caucus of one?
First off, I know I'm not the only person who feels this way. I just seem to be the only one saying it out loud. So maybe the entirety of my next year will be setting an example that you don't have to settle. You don't have to go along to get along. Look, I didn't get any bills this year that they know of. The fact of the matter is, any bill with my name on it's not going anywhere. And I know that. But that doesn't mean I can't do policy work. That doesn't mean I can't bring stakeholders together and find good ways to do things. And then maybe just suggest to someone else that this might be a good idea. I actually got a couple of bills through this year that are decent policy decisions. by just playing it cool. I don't need the credit. I don't need my name in lights. I don't need to grandstand. I just want to help people, and I want them to be treated with decency and dignity. And I think this is the way forward.
Senator Daniel Thatcher, thank you so much for your time. I'm sure that we'll talk again sometime down the road.
Brian, you're a good man no matter what everybody else says.
Well, I tend to listen to what everyone else says. Thank you, man. That's going to do it for this week's show. I'd like to remind you to subscribe to the podcast and leave us a rating and review if you haven't already. That's the best way to help us get more listeners for this show. I'd really appreciate that. Remember to sign up for my newsletter at utahpoliticalwatch.news. It's free, but you can become a paying subscriber for as little as $5 a month, which makes podcasts like this one possible. I'm an independent journalist, and this work takes time and resources, and I can't do it for free. That's why I rely on subscribers to keep doing what I'm doing. So consider becoming a paying subscriber to make more shows like this possible. If there's a guest you'd like to hear on the show or a subject you'd like me to tackle, reach out, send me an email, or message me on social media. I'd love to hear from you. Once again, I'd like to thank Senator Daniel Thatcher for being my guest this week. Thank you for listening. We'll be back soon with another episode.